Afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the philosophy department here at PC and the director of the Humanities Forum. Welcome to this week's forum. It's a pleasure to see all of you here this afternoon. As a reminder, each of our events lasts until about 4:15 or so, after which we'll have a reception just down the hall in the great room. Please come and join us there to continue our conversation. Today is the first of 3 special lectures this semester that are concentrated on Calvin. To introduce our guest today, please welcome Professor Adrian Weimer from the Department of History and Classics, and welcome again to Afternoon's Forum. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Raymond and to all of you for being here, and especially to our friend Esther Chung-Kim. We're delighted that she's here. I got to know Esther through our work on the American Society of Church History and the Council, and she's a leading voice in Reformation studies and church history more broadly. She teaches in the area of global Christianity, Reformation, and religion and social change, and so her expertise truly is broad, and we're delighted that she's here. Professor Chung-Kim did her BA at Drew University, her Master's of Divinity at Princeton Theological Seminary, and her doctoral work at Duke University. She has some fantastic scholarly works out. The ones I wanted to, I couldn't list them all right here because we don't have time, but the few I wanted to note are her book, which came out in 2011, which is called Inventing Authority: The Use of the Church Fathers in Reformation Debates over the Eucharist. She's also published a Reformation commentary on Scripture on the book of Acts, and most recently articles on John Calvin on poverty and wealth, and retrievals and reception in the Renaissance and Reformation. And her new book I'm very excited about that she's working on now is called Economics of Faith. It's a book on religious reform and poor relief in early modern Europe. So please join me in welcoming Professor Chung-Kim.
Well, let me just start off by saying how glad I am to be here today with all of you. I think in many ways, coming out to a town called Providence, and then speaking on Calvin, if Calvin had a sense of humor, I think this would tickle him. So glad to be here. I also hail from the East Coast, so get a chance to come out of California and come to the East Coast is a treat in the sense of familiarity. So I don't mind the cold. It's fine with me. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming to this talk and giving me a chance to share my work with you. So what I want to do today is I'm going to start off, let's see here, with the title of my talk, Aid for the Refugees, Religion, Migration, and Poor Relief in 16th Century Geneva. And I only have a couple of PowerPoint slides highlighting a few of the quotes that I'm reading so you can follow along. So just to give a quick overview, this is how the talk will progress. I'm going to cover 4 main areas. After a short introduction to the topic, I'm going to talk about the social political context. Then I'm going to move into the issue of migration and religious refugees. And then I'm going to move then third into the religious ideals for poor relief. And then finally, the functions of the French Fund. And then I'll conclude after that. So various studies have already recognized that the role of religion in early modern poor relief is determined by the religious values and concerns, and that these concerns and values were not limited to doctrinal or just intellectual works, but rather these religious concerns emerged in the forms and practices of social institutions. Another place they emerged, these religious values, also emerged in rationale for political and legal actions around poor relief. So to hone in then for today, I want to look at the city of Geneva during the time of John Calvin. In the Genevan city records of 1538, there's a man identified as Claude Moshe who requests alms for support. However, his request is not to support himself, rather to help certain poor orphan children who beg him to help with some small fee so that they could learn his profession. Moshe, most likely a barber surgeon, requests funds from the city to help these youth purchase the basic tools and equipment needed to further develop in their potential apprenticeships. This example reveals that 16th century poor relief encompassed much more than self-advocacy, since these requests for charity were often mediated through someone who was in a position to help others. This intermediary role that Claude Moshe plays consists of recommending other persons to be the recipients of charity. While citizens like Moshe would intercede for native Genevan inhabitants, John Calvin, as chief minister in Geneva, took on the intermediary role for religious refugees. Starting in the 1540s, Calvin would be a regular recommender of persons. While Calvin made requests for poor relief to the Genevan councils, most of Calvin's requests to help poor refugees who were hoping to settle in or travel through Geneva applied to the newly created Bourse Française, or the French Fund. Since Andre Bühler's work on Calvin's economic and social views and Robert Kingdon's work on moral discipline in Calvin's Geneva, others have followed suit to elucidate Calvin's views, his impact, and the development of religion and society in early modern Geneva. Building on many of these studies, this talk explores a newly emerging line of inquiry that explains the connection between religious reform and care for the poor from the perspective of migration. Recent studies on migration have revealed the impact of religious refugees on the development of religious identity as carriers of religious practice, and have even offered a reinterpretation of the Reformation. In his book on religious refugees, Nicholas Terpstra points out, and here's the quote. Let me just say, this is a picture of young Calvin, in case you have no understanding of what he looked like. This is a painting portrait from the Flemish art school. Once again, it's not a photograph, so we don't know if he actually looked like this, but this is a representation of him. So just to have a sort of visual image in case some of you are wondering what he looked like. So Nicholas Terpstra's quote, he writes, "Charity was where abstract religious doctrines hit fixed social realities." Nicholas Terpstra points out that religious communities saw charity as a moral obligation and a natural outgrowth of their distinctive religious commitments. 16th century Geneva provides an illuminating case study because migration of religious refugees reinforced the establishment of a Reformed congregation. The migration into Geneva complicated the way that newly emerging religious values distinctly shaped social reforms around poor relief, in part because many of the ministers were religious refugees themselves, including Calvin, who served as leading pastor from his return to Geneva in 1541 until his death in 1564, so roughly under 20 years. Along with the political, economic, and social reasons for migration that accompanied the search for better opportunities, the escape from unfavorable circumstances, religious change and the ensuing conflict resulted in migration trends and transnational movements, producing large numbers of refugees, exiles, and displaced people. Such religiously motivated migrations were significant because they reshaped religious identity and contributed to the development of religious culture throughout Europe. One major impact of these refugees on major urban centers was the development of poor relief. As refugees and exiles added to the population growth of various cities and destabilized local economies, the burden on social welfare systems prompted the greater need for organized poor relief. Therefore, poor relief can act as a focal point for understanding the intersection between migration and reformed identity formation. Poor relief illustrates the way in which distinctive religious commitments encourage the values of community and discipline to support a new category of poor, religious refugees. Multiple waves of refugees shaped the development of Geneva's religious culture. For example, giving to the native poor as well as the refugees was reflected in the wills left by deceased Genevans. By the end of the 16th century, it became a common practice for Genevans to include one of the refugee funds in their wills, in addition to the general hospital, which would have taken care of natives, and the academy, which is supporting education. Although many refugees would return to France when the opportunity arose, many refugees also ended up staying in Geneva or nearby towns if they had the permission and means to settle, including many of these French refugee pastors. Hence, the development of poor relief for religious refugees became an integral part of Reformed community formation during Calvin's pastorate in 16th century Geneva, because the social support structure for foreigners would help promote the establishment of Reformed religion. So in order to support this argument, first this talk will investigate the socio-political context of Geneva. Second, how migration and the resettlement of refugees brought new challenges to poor relief. Third, how Calvin's religious ideals for high disciplinary practices, communicated mostly through the consistory, would reveal religious values for the chief minister and his supporters. And finally, this talk will explain the close connection between religious refugees and new models of poor relief that ultimately contributed to the Reformed identity formation. So how did migration impact the development of Protestant reform movements and poor relief systems? Because religious reform and migration and poor relief, all three of these actually occur simultaneously or nearly simultaneously, it is worth understanding how they are interrelated. Calvin's status as a religious refugee was not peripheral, but rather central to the development of Reformed religion in Geneva. A recent sociological approach may help or may provide some helpful clues to reach a more nuanced conception of exile for the early modern period. According to Carolyn Chen's ethnographic study, even though her study focuses on a different time, place, and culture, her thesis offers a potential interpretive lens for understanding a particular dimension of the Calvinist reform in Geneva, namely, the ways that migration intensifies religious experience and demands a higher level of discipline and sacrifice from its adherents. In her effort to understand the pivotal role of religion in the way immigrants reconstruct their lives in a new place, Chen argues that religion instilled the values of moral self-discipline to ground immigrants during a time of uprooting, migration, and resettlement. Specifically, here's the next quote. She says, "Religion, because of its sacred power, makes ethical demands that other organizations cannot. For example, the Rotary Club cannot ask its members to sell all their possessions and live in poverty." Well, they could, but no one would do it, but they could. Most secular institutions lack the legitimate authority to make the demands that religions do. In addition, the sacred becomes more powerful during times of transition. So the experience of displacement for French religious refugees cultivated a greater identification with their religious identity and higher expectations of discipline to maintain that new identity. Calvin understood the migration of Reformed refugees with the mindset of religious meaning and faithful purpose. Many religious refugees made sense of their experience of migration through biblical metaphors of exile. For example, Hans Lehmann describes a refugee community presenting interpretations of exile as a journey of faith, even providential and integral to the evangelical identity formation. Biblical models gave expression to migratory and settling experiences that infused the struggle of displacement with deep religious meaning and purpose. Religious refugees could now understand their migration as analogous to the biblical narrative and claim their identity as the righteous exiles by demonstrating a high commitment to their religion and to their reform. Hence, migration impacted religious commitments because the social dislocation of religious refugees led many of them to derive their new identity as defenders of the Reformed religion. Geneva's example illustrates the dynamic forces at work in the midst of a continuous influx of refugees from France. The transition to Reformed religion under the leadership of John Calvin, and the development of parallel poor relief systems for natives and foreigners. And this became then the model for refugee poor relief in other Reformed towns and cities. Calvin's writings and the institutions he supported, like the Consistory and the French Fund, reflected his imprint on the shape of Genevan culture. In the institutes and the commentaries, Calvin tended to set a high-reaching standard for charity by looking not only at action, but also intention. While he continued to articulate high standards for discipline, he also provided more moderate expectations for moral behavior in his sermons and catechism. If we compare Calvin's lofty ideals expressed in his institutes and commentaries, we might assume that Calvin's views had a minimal impact on Genevan poor relief, since every need was not met and the struggle toward communal unity was fraught with division and internal conflict. However, when we consider the more moderate ideals from his sermons and catechisms, then the estimation of Calvin's influence can be more nuanced. It is also important to remember that sermons and catechism enjoyed a much larger audience in Geneva, since most Genevans and religious refugees would attend the sermon weekly, and the youth would learn the catechism lessons throughout the entire year. So now I want to delve into these four areas and go a little bit deeper. So first, the socio-political context. In 1535, Genevan magistrates reallocated former ecclesiastical revenues to start a public education system for children and to establish the general hospital. Now, this general hospital then replaced all the smaller ecclesiastical hospitals and hospices. Okay, so you get one general hospital in Geneva. As Geneva's main social welfare institution, the general hospital centralized all the services provided to the poor, the sick, and the disabled. The largest number of the poor housed at the general hospital tended to be young children, orphans, as well as some adults who could not care for themselves because they were blind or crippled. During the second half of the 1530s, the city council records indicate that recurring requests for charity became a major expenditure for the city. By 1538, now this is the same year that Claude Moschim will make his request, by 1538, the city officials differentiated between the deserving and the undeserving. And the council demanded to know if the recipients were worthy of pity. For example, when a small group came to the council to request alms, the council decided to give wheat portions to only 2 of them. The others received reprimands because they could live on their labor, since the purpose of alms was to give to the truly poor and not to them. The Genevan Council had an understanding of workers' responsibility. So as long as they could work or legitimately earn wages, then it was their responsibility to live on that labor, whatever it might provide. Geneva's decision to adopt Reformed religion allowed a fundamentally religious people to resist a certain type of ecclesiastical establishment and still practice religion by transferring the source of authority to the scriptures, early church fathers, and the ministers who rightly interpreted these ancient sources. Known as a fiery preacher, William Farel recruited Calvin in 1536 to join the Reform movement in Geneva. However, early in 1538, Farel and Calvin met severe resistance when they tried to enforce disciplinary action by excommunicating those who refused to subscribe to the new Reformed Confession of Faith. When the Genevan Council reiterated its commitment to the Evangelical Reformation, civil magistrates intervened in worship and ordered the ministers to not refuse the Lord's Supper to anyone. When they then tried to limit the pastor's preaching, the conflict then escalated, leading to the dismissal of Calvin and Farel from Geneva in 1538. So Calvin ends up leaving Geneva. However, when the political climate shifted in 1541, Calvin was asked to return to Geneva as its leading minister. The convergence of several factors, namely the Genevan political desire for self-rule, the late medieval church's possession of visible wealth, and then the embrace of the Reformation by Geneva's strongest military ally, Bern, resulted in Geneva's change, religious change, to Reformed Protestantism. Political goals aligned with the people's growing allegiance to Reformed Protestantism as the accepted religion. However, determining the exact role that Reformed religion would play would be a matter of continuous negotiation. Although Geneva adopted the Reformation before Calvin's arrival, he played a major role in its early formative stages. Calvin's work involved not merely the destructive act of pulling down the old, but also the constructive implementation of rebuilding Geneva's institutions. In his ecclesiastical ordinances, Calvin established the basis of a consistory. Now, I've already mentioned that word before, so let me explain a little bit further here. The consistory was a moral tribunal inspired by the matrimonial tribunal of Bern to replace the bishop's courts. Throughout the period of Calvin's ministry, the consistory investigated family problems, matrimonial claims, moral violations, and any other socially deviant behaviors, including usurers, wastrels, and beggars. For example, the consistory examined two figures who were accused of usury. Reflecting the moral concern for fair economic exchange, the consistory monitored the arbitration of disputes and the surveillance of morals. Calvin's interest in the political and economic stability of Geneva emerged from a desire to make Geneva an exemplary model for the practice of Reformed religion. Now moving on to section 2, migration. Calvin's arrival in Geneva was part of a larger migration pattern of religious refugees moving to cities like Geneva that were more favorable to Reformed religion. Since the adoption of the Reformation, Geneva found itself inundated by a large number of mostly poor foreigners that were passing through the city. William Nafee's work provides a helpful starting point by elucidating the conflicts that arose from the settlement of religious refugees, including the Genevan responses to French foreigners. According to Nafee, during a period of from 1538 to 1539, the city hospital, so this is a general hospital, assisted over 10,000 poor strangers. as they pass through. Now, this does not include the native Genevans they would have helped on a regular basis, which made up about 5% of the Genevan population. So Geneva at this time is a city of about 12,000, and they already support about 600 of their native poor. And they're now trying to accommodate over 10,000 poor refugees coming through in a span of 1 year. Okay, so this tells you about the enormous pressure. So overwhelmed by this financial burden on the city budget, a city guard was assigned the task of ridding the city of poor foreigners section by section because of the inability of the city hospital to meet their needs. As Nafi describes, the city ordered an inspection to expel all without the means to live in Geneva, and strangers, which is another word for foreigners, were threatened with torture if they did not vacate the city in 3 days. However, the city council did show some compassion. Okay? They ordered the guards to provide bread for the poor who were escorted out of town, and they gave Calvin permission to put on a special Eucharistic service for strangers who had arrived too late in the spring of 1544 to attend the Easter service. It is actually through these worship services that Calvin had consistent contact with these poor refugees, even as they passed through Geneva. Among the refugees, one group that settled in Geneva was this cadre of French ministers who represented the broader desire of the French refugees to settle permanently in Geneva as part of a new migration pattern spurred by newly developing religious identities. This great migration from France reflected the changes in religious climate as intolerance toward non-Catholics increased and more French Protestants opted to migrate to city-states that were practicing new forms of worship and religious life. While religious reasons were a common motivation for leaving France, the types of people flooding into Geneva tended to be those with some mobility, such as artisans, tradesmen, day laborers, as well as teachers, ministers, lawyers, physicians, and printers. With the noticeable waves of religious refugees pouring into Geneva, its relief structures and social services were clearly burdened by the sudden population growth in the span of a few years. This influx of religious refugees resulted in rising conflict and attention to the immediate needs created by the demands on resources. The press of refugees continued to strain Genevan economics and social relationships. Since the responsibilities of the general hospital extended only to the Genevan native inhabitants, only to Genevan citizens, there was no other relief organization to absorb this shockwave of need. While migration waves brought many poor refugees, the influx also brought a significant group of prominent, wealthy French and newly arriving Italians. In the 1540s and into the 1550s, Geneva became reliant upon many of these wealthy foreigners for liquid capital to help ease Geneva's economic deficit. These French aristocrats were willing to purchase bourgeois rights as the main route to assimilation. The Genevan Senate allowed for a limited number of foreigners to purchase the high price of bourgeois status. And this showed an interest in keeping the right sort of stranger, namely those who could afford it. However, the dual forces of hospitality on one hand and xenophobia on the other created tensions that hindered an easy exchange. Although the Genevans were willing to assist transient strangers and foreigners passing through, they demonstrated greater reluctance and opposition towards settling immigrants. Some Genevans saw the wealthier, skilled foreigners as unwanted competition for resources and markets. The magistrates tried to limit the ability of foreign merchants to undercut local businesses, and at the same time allowed more prominent foreigners to purchase civic rights as bourgeois. Such policies demonstrated conflicting priorities, because some Genevan magistrates did not want foreigners to settle in Geneva, but at the same time willingly accepted the financial payments of the wealthier refugees for the rights to settle. According to Marc Valéry, the influx of French supporters created an opportunity for Calvin to shape economic discipline, as shown by the fact that 1 out of every 20 cases heard by the consistory from 1542 to 1564 dealt directly with commercial practices, such as fraud, price gouging, or hoarding. And then during periods of economic strain, with the onset of a poor harvest, or during the height of French migration into Geneva, the number of cases devoted to commerce tripled. However, the wealthier strangers who remained in Geneva arose an ethnic backlash. After 1546, there was a marked increase in the anti-refugee sentiment, and also a greater incidence of trouble relating both to the care of these poor strangers as well as to the assimilation of those intending to remain in Geneva. The earlier cooperation between the Genevan magistrates and the French ministers deteriorated rapidly as the troubles between magistrates and ministers became tinged with anti-French rhetoric. Based on the consistory records, there was actually a noticeable shift in the types of infractions that the consistory members were watching for in the second half of the 1540s. In addition to the usual culprits of bad behavior, exemplified by drunkenness, blasphemy, contested promises of marriage, the consistory records exhibit a growing concern with xenophobic words and rebels. For example, in 1547, the registers of the consistory reveal increasingly sharp debates between the followers of Calvin versus the enfants de Genève, or the sons and daughters of Geneva. I like to call them the babes of Geneva. They're the native Genevans, right? That same year that this anti-French rhetoric is increasing is the same year that 500 French poor arrived from Strasbourg, which then added to the economic strain of poor relief in Geneva. In addition to the council and consistory reports, Calvin's letter to Pierre Viret reflects his own experience concerning the volatile dissensions in Geneva due to the growing hostility between French refugee population and Genevan natives. In 1550, a certain woman named Bechota expressed a sentiment prevalent not only in Geneva, but I would say in many European towns and cities, faced with similar pressures of religious refugees, when she clearly demarcated them as outsiders. So here's a quote. She taunted some refugees by saying, "I am not talking to you. You are not one of us." Her friend Jeanne remarked, "Go join your other French devils." So from 1547 into the 1550s, the consistory is dealing with an increasing number of xenophobic violations, indicating the growing number of public expression of anti-foreign sentiment. In the years of 1548 to 1554, Geneva severely limited the number of new French accepted into bourgeois status. And inhabitants who were favorable to refugees clashed with their opponents who sought to restrict access to bourgeois rights. As the main disciplinary institution, the Genevan consistory consisted of all the French ministers, remember, who were religious refugees themselves, as well as lay commissioners who reviewed cases of moral infractions. Calvin's influence was noticeable in the consistory as he became actively involved in multiple areas of Genevan politics, including international diplomacy, economic interactions, and business dealings. As tensions arose between Genevan citizens and French refugees, the consistory began to admonish the offense of engaging in insulting or discriminating behavior toward French immigrants. In this process, there was something of a resurgence of classic nationalism in which the Enfants de Genève confronted the Frenchmen, since the French refugees far outnumbered any of the other refugee groups. A recorded case in 1550 reflected a common perception about French refugees. When admonished about inappropriate words, Georgia Merma, who was the wife of the shoemaker Jean Chormet, argued that the consistory would not punish the French, or not punish a French person, while a Genevan would be chastised for the same offense. This idea that disciplining was reserved for the Genevans, but not for the French, reflected traces of hostility that would become commonplace in the 1550s consistory registers. Meanwhile, such complaints also revealed that French immigrants came less often before the consistory for violations. One explanation for this was that religious refugees who chose to stay in Geneva tended to support high disciplinary standards, while refugees who balked at Geneva's disciplinary actions often just left the city. Within a fractious social context, Calvin sought to reconstruct a highly disciplined society where the people of Geneva, whether rich or poor, citizen or foreigner, could lean into their new religious identity as members of a reformed community. So this then leads us to the third section, religious ideals. In this context of ethnic tension and xenophobia caused by the influx of poor and wealthy refugees, Calvin, along with several other ministers and wealthy donors, helped to start the French Fund. This was a fund for needy foreigners. While centralization of poor relief was the general trend going on in many parts of Western Europe at this time, the French Fund was unique in its support for the specialized needs of foreigners. Like most cities, earlier Genevan poor relief policy had very limited support for foreigners, usually consisting of temporary respite before ushering them out of the city. Right? In response to religious refugees who understood their exile as suffering for the faith, elders and deacons set up a structure to aid poor refugees. To alleviate the burden created by the refugees, the French Fund developed as a social welfare arm of the church, supported through the donations of wealthy French refugees and Calvin's consistent backing. Hence, the establishment of the French Fund in the late 1540s provides a telling example of how the experience of migration enhanced the religious concern for communal care through their support of a relief fund for poor foreigners. Because the French Fund eased the burden on the indigenous welfare system, Geneva became an oasis for French Reformed refugees. While the General Hospital in Geneva remained a secular institution of the city run by city magistrates, the French Fund emerged as a program sponsored by religious leaders to accommodate the enormous financial needs of the poor refugees. Within this context, Calvin's writings reveal the biblical principles of compassion, generosity, and communal responsibility. With compassion as the driving force, Calvin urges generous giving as the right use of wealth. Believers who act out of pure generosity set a countercultural model of virtue. In his visitation to the sick, Calvin calls ministers to set a true example of charity by giving bodily relief to the afflicted poor. In continuity with the late medieval period, he retains this concern for the poor. In his sermon on Galatians, Calvin summarizes, and this is the next quote, "The church is not triumphant in this world. She does not shine with the kind of splendor and magnificence that would capture our hearts with just one glimpse and make us her devotees. Wealth, popularity, pomp, and splendor are not the way God desires church to be known. So resisting the attractiveness of the church based on splendor and wealth, Calvin teaches his parishioners to accept material wealth as a secondary form of blessing, never the primary. Calvin's commentaries in the 1550s call for generosity around poor relief, which would provide continued support for the French Fund. Yet Calvin also exhorts his believers to have the right intention in caring for others. Those who think they are faithful as long as they do no harm to another misunderstand compassion. Rather, believers must be sufficiently concerned about their neighbors in order to help the needy ones with the wealth God has granted. For Calvin, a true concern for others precedes work of care and compassion. And whenever compassion serves as the basis for social interactions, then the community thrives, since misfortunes are shared. Calvin urges empathy for others, because the common response that most people have to a poor person is one of indifference. For Calvin, the root of charity is empathy. And here we have another quote. A poor person, he says, is a living representation of our own selves. And if we deny him or her our help, it is as if we were refusing it to ourselves. In his own time, Calvin describes the mild annoyance that many people experience when they hear about other people suffering from a lack of money or health. Because many people find caring for the poor a burdensome chore, they will, he says, deliberately harden their hearts and be perfectly content for others to go hungry, as long as their business is going well. Biblical notions such as blessed are the merciful are counterintuitive, since most people consider being blessed when things are going well for them, and they do not need to think about other people's misfortunes or the suffering happening around them. In contrast, Calvin presents a higher standard for his listeners, namely, to be moved by compassion and a desire to help those in need. He instructs, helping others amounts to nothing unless we are moved by a love which comes from the heart and which bids us to bear our share of the misfortune we see around us. Because God has bound us all together, no one can turn away and live only for himself. We must enlarge our affections as the law of love requires. Calvin's message called for believers to avoid indifference and instead to ascend beyond the common reaction. In addition to his commentaries, sermons, and treatises, Calvin sought to promote a high moral standard of social behavior through disciplinary actions of the consistory. In order to build a thriving Reformed church and society, the consistory became a way to communicate qualifications of an ideal citizen, an ideal resident, spouse, or parent. It is clear, though, that these ideals were tempered and balanced by socioeconomic realities. Teaching newly accepted religious behaviors and reforming old ways preoccupied the consistory in its early years, even though the implementation of discipline would not be equally applied nor universally realized. More specifically, Calvin's religious views and the actions of the consistory worked against an internalized and individual ethos of the market. In his commentaries on the Gospels, Calvin claims that the kingdom of heaven is open to all who have either made a sober use of riches or patiently endured the want of them. In his interpretation of the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, Calvin focuses on the attitude of the rich man by criticizing the lack of empathy and compassion when the rich man ignores Lazarus' poverty and his distress with cold and hunger and sickness. Praise for Lazarus does not arise from his abject poverty, but rather, Lazarus is commended for patient endurance of the cross, which always springs from faith and a genuine fear of God. Those who glory in their abundant wealth or dwell on their miserable poverty, both of them fall prey to the problematic fixation on earthly possessions. While Calvin claims the freedom of believers in matters of giving, he doesn't want to set any kind of, standard or rule, he does echo a warning based on Luke 16, namely, that believers must one day render an account of how one's wealth was used. Any wrongful use of wealth or lack of mercy will become apparent when, quote, we give an account of what God has placed in our hands, unquote. In the catechisms, students learned, we are forbidden either to seize our neighbor's goods by violence, by trick or cunning, or any other devious means. We may not long to enrich ourselves at the expense of our brethren. According to Calvin, the purpose of any good thing is to create an attitude of thanksgiving that bridles any excess. Yet, this attitude must be intentionally cultivated. Such teachings help to explain Natalie Davis's observation that while gift exchanges, especially lavish gifts, gift giving, were curtailed, the welfare system in Geneva expanded. So the giving of expensive gifts was sort of, you saw a decline, but then the welfare system is expanding in Geneva. So this then leads to our last section, the functions of poor relief. Calvin argues that the purpose of wealth is to practice kindness toward neighbors and to help them in their time of need, instead of squandering wealth on all kinds of trifles and excesses. Guided by his religious ideals, his socio-political status as a foreign minister, his cultural awareness of ongoing ethnic hostilities, and the periodic urgencies of economic distress, Calvin included giving to the poor as a practice of Reformed religion by connecting religious ideals of compassion and generosity with communal social responsibility. As religious conflicts and wars prompted the migration of French religious refugees, requests for alms overwhelmed the local relief structures, leading cities to drive out these poor refugees. A small city like Geneva lacked sufficient resources to handle these poor foreigners coming in addition to caring for their native poor. However, as French pastors, teachers, doctors, businessmen, and artisans settled in Geneva, many of these foreigners displayed a high commitment to the Reformed religion. For many, their religious commitment deepened with the displacement of migration. As strangers in a new land, the refugees embraced the Reformed religion as a part of their new identity. With French ministers leading the way, these refugees helped build up the Reformed congregation in Geneva by accepting and even enforcing some level of discipline, by supporting the activities of the French Fund, and finally by serving as deacons in the welfare institutions. French refugees who ended up serving as deacons were responsible for caring for the caring ministries of the church. Calvin highlighted the specific role of the diaconate in the ancient church to show that the church took seriously its role in poor relief. According to Calvin's interpretation of the early church, the deacons held the task of dispensing the church's goods to care for the poor. They were the stewards who collected the alms offered at the altar, distributed them to the poor, and cared for the sick. Drawing from biblical models of Acts 6 and 1 Timothy 3, Calvin interpreted the role of the deacons as those engaged in the ministry of relief. While a common role of deacons in the medieval church was to assist a priest with the liturgy, Calvin created a permanent office of deacons within the church to care for poor foreigners. In order to reconstruct religious and social institutions, Calvin communicated his religious ideals for the formation of a newly emerging religious reform community modeled on his interpretation of the early church. Calvin's unabashed support for a comprehensive poor relief system for refugees arose from his understanding of the biblical mandate to care for the poor and his aim to build a model reform community in Geneva. Calvin sought to guide his congregation toward a shared communal identity rooted in the commitment to reform faith rather than a national or ethnic identity. Because of ethnic tensions, Calvin strove to bring cohesion to a divided community by emphasizing a new collective identity that would transcend ethnicity or citizenship and instead revolve around religion, for which Geneva would serve as the example of the true church. The example of migration once again reinforced this connection to Reformed faith, as the harrowing experience of dislocation was interpreted along biblical motifs of exile and participation in a shared struggle. The establishment of the French Fund for Poor Relief supported the Reformed biblical vision of a model Christian community. The influx of foreigners boosted the Reformation in Geneva. In this historical context, the French ministers in Geneva were not only religious leaders, but also social leaders for the French exile community. According to the records of the French Fund, Calvin, along with 3 other prominent ministers, donated regularly to the French Fund and recommended support for needy persons. The main source of funding came from prominent refugees who left sums of money for the French Fund in their wills. This institution of the French Fund revealed the consistent effort of French refugees who supported each other through economic and social ties. The wealthier refugees tended to unite with other prominent refugee families, whether in marriage or business transactions. These French Calvinists developed reciprocal bonds of community through their economic system of support. Despite the gaps in the records, sometime in the second half of the 1540s, the French Fund was established to be a welfare institution and a refugee agency that blended pragmatism, social theory, and religion. Seeking to address the causes of poverty whenever possible, the French Fund demonstrated that charity was a complex network of donors and recipients. A cadre of donors from the class of wealthy French immigrants financed and administered the assistance, ranging from temporary housing, job retraining, tools or raw materials for artisans to set up trade, loans or grants to pay rent on a house or a business, stipends for wet nurses, childcare, and medical expenses, in addition to the regular handout and money given to travelers. The French Fund in Geneva was an anomaly in the 16th century because its sole responsibility was to aid foreigners, because deacons and pastors supervised the work, not city councils, and because its activity was financed independently of the city council and the budget. By supporting the French Fund, donors were also supporting families of missionaries and pastors who were sent on missions outside of Geneva to support other Reformed communities. With the social safety network of the French Fund in place for refugees, missionary activity reached its height in the second half of the 1550s. The French Fund expanded its role to a wide range of activities, including the spread of Reformed religion. Ministers were not the only ones among French expatriates to exhibit dedication to a collective religious identity. According to Janine Olson's recent work on Laurent de Normandie, who was a businessman and a financier of the Genevan book trade, the French Fund channeled money and books to Normandy, who arranged then for colporteurs to transport Reformed books, such as Calvin's commentaries and Calvin's sermons, secretly into France. In cases where these book smugglers got caught, or worse, lost their lives during these dangerous missions, Normandy agreed to cover the cost of lost books. This French expatriate funded the losses of what was more than just a risky business venture and would have served as an intermediary recommender for poor relief for these coal porters' families who were left behind in Geneva, while their main breadwinner would be off on one of these missions. The expansion of the French Fund to support Reformed congregations in France through the work of coal porters demonstrated a high level of dedication to the growth of Reformed religion. Hence, religious migration plus dedication to Reformed faith encouraged a poor relief system geared for foreigners who advanced a collective religious identity to expand Reformed communities beyond Geneva. So in conclusion, in the 16th century Genevan context, waves of migration spurred both greater socioeconomic demands on poor relief and a stronger religious commitment to Reformed religion, especially as refugees filled the ranks of leading pastors in Geneva. These concerns converged for Calvin as a religious refugee and pastor, leading a mixed church community of natives and settling refugees. Calvin's contribution was to translate the religious ethics of caring for the poor to a community of refugees struggling with their displacement, as well as natives struggling to adjust to a demographic, socioeconomic, and religious changes. An integral aspect of communal development was a poor relief structure that would meet the needs of religious refugees without overtaxing the city's existing system. The social values of charitable donations and philanthropy that emerged from Calvin's economics of faith have had lasting repercussions on Genevans institutions. Many French refugees and those Genevans who supported them were willing to promote or at least cooperate with a high level of religious discipline and funding poor relief for foreigners. Through migration patterns and the dissemination of Reformed literature, Calvinist ideals impacted not only Geneva and neighboring Swiss regions, but also pockets of Germany, France, the Netherlands, England, and Scotland, as well as Eastern Europe. And so my last slide is actually a map. This map shows sort of where the Calvinist Reform regions were anchored, but it also shows Huguenot centers, so areas where Reformed Protestantism wouldn't have been accepted by the political authorities or by the nation itself, but still there were these little centers. Those are the little triangle you'll see throughout France, but also in other parts. So Calvinist communities were often comprised of people claiming a religious identity differing from the dominant religion, either Catholicism or Lutheranism. Rather than spearheading an isolated movement in Geneva, Calvin supported an international operation through his contacts with a high number of refugees passing through Geneva, through his publications, through his extensive letter-writing campaign, through his students at the Academy of Geneva, and through his support of mission efforts, particularly into France. The broad extent of Calvin's appeal demonstrated the aspirations for a strong corporate religious identity among minority groups even beyond the early modern period. Calvin communicated his ideals for poor relief and a proper use of wealth to enhance the spiritual growth of his parishioners, which he believed would lead to establishing and expanding Reformed religion. The destabilizing crisis of religious refugees inspired the key ministers, as well as wealthy lay French, to fund a charitable venture for foreigners. Consequently, this organization of wealthy foreigners supporting poorer foreigners concretely linked charity and social responsibility with religious commitment. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a terrific lecture. As is our tradition at the Humanities Forum, we'd like to give the first question to a student. What brave student would like to ask a question?
Not a student.
Not a student, but we know you're gearing up. All right.
Hmm. Yeah, so it would have been a natural place, and I mentioned briefly in my talk that in some ways it was an oasis. And one of the reasons I think it became that is because there were already people there, so there would have been a contact. The other reason would have been, at least in Calvin's case, he actually had no intention of going to Geneva. His original plan when he was leaving France was actually to go to Strasbourg. But because of the war that was going on and the way the military forces were advancing, he couldn't get there. So he ends up funneling with others through Geneva. It becomes sort of this pathway, and partly because the wars don't actually, they're always worried. If you read the council records of Geneva, they're always worried that the war is going to come down there and affect them. But they actually are, in some ways, truly an oasis. It doesn't come down that far. It doesn't interrupt life there. So in some ways, it becomes a natural migratory path for many people. And I think the other reason why it becomes this oasis is actually because of the French fund. And I only talked about the French fund today, but there actually was also an Italian fund. There was a Dutch fund, an English fund. This idea of creating a fund for foreigners because they don't actually fit into the common poor relief systems of many European cities who provide for their natives, who provide for the enfants de Jeunesse, right, their sons and daughters. So there is no real relief for them. So this idea of creating these foreign funds, start with the French fund. They're the largest group, and there's also wealthier refugees who can support it, but eventually then it also leads to these other refugee funds as well.
Build on that question really quick. Was there a religious test for who could receive funds?
A religious test? No, but if you're staying in Geneva and you remain there, the assumption is you agree to the Reformed Confession of Faith and that you could be called before the consistory, right? I mean, there are some people who resist that, and this becomes an ongoing debate, and sometimes they have to leave. In fact, one of the things that happens in some of these refugees is you get called before the consistory, and you don't want to go, so you just leave town. Sometimes leaving behind a wife and kids, right? So then they become poor, and then they have to take care of them. So then this becomes a question of, do we still take care of them? How do we take care of them? Because the person who was called before the consistory left, they were the main supporter, financial provider for the family. And so this kind of discussion comes up, and yeah, so that's part of it too. I think there's a hand over there. Yeah. I think if you look at the consistory records, you could argue that there are less French refugees coming up than native Genevans. But I think the reason for that, and this is Carolyn Chen's sociological ethnographic study, is that when these French refugees come, their sense of gaining a Reformed identity comes with it this greater commitment to the high disciplines. It sort of says, we are, this journey of faith that we've taken, this, resettlement, this migration pattern almost pushes us to claim the Reformed identity because they kind of are out of their homeland. And so one argument that's made is that the people self-selected, right? The people who would have been happy to live in Geneva came. And therefore, those are the people, if they didn't like it, they left. And so the French who are there would have espoused this kind of high disciplinary standard and therefore would have tried to maintain it. Does that mean that there were no French refugees who came before the consistory? No, that's not true as well. Some refugees do come, as the example I just mentioned. But he leaves, actually. He decides, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm leaving. He just leaves town. So it's not that there aren't any French refugees coming before the consistory, but I can see how this perception would come up because you would see that the French refugees who are there would be the type that would not only be supporting a high disciplinary action, but sometimes be the ones enforcing it. Right. Yeah, so on the one hand, they're glad for the French funds, right? Because the general hospital cannot take care of them. And they do try initially, right? And this is why if you look at the city expenditures, like poor relief, just the money just goes out if you look at the city budget. This is a problem. And so in one sense, they would be glad somebody else can take care of them, that there's a fund for the other group. And they don't have that responsibility anymore. That burden is relieved to some degree. But at least according to Nafi's study, he argues that the ethnic backlash occurs when wealthier Frenchmen come in and settle. And so there is a sense of some competition. But there's some conflict because there are some Genevans who are actually glad for these French refugees. They're the ones who are in business transactions with them. They have business dealings, they have business partners amongst these French refugees. They're happy to have these new influx of business partners. But then there are some who obviously feel threatened by that and therefore respond differently. And it's, and I think honestly, if there's any backlash, I think the backlash would come out because of the consistory. I mean, think about it. You have a consistory of all the French pastors, lay commissioners. Calvin has the most influence, and he's just calling people out, for any kind of bad behavior. And then they have to report to the consistory. So if I were to say, why are people annoyed with the French, it would be that reason. It would be the people who are called before the consistory. It would be people who might have some business competition. As I mentioned, there were certain types of people who tended to come to Geneva. They tended to be the ones who could be a little bit mobile with their businesses, as well as people like doctors, lawyers, printers, things like that. Yeah. Do you want to call me?
Yes, go ahead.
So the population actually is increasing across Europe right now. So the idea that what migration does is it swells population in certain cities in a short amount of time. But population is already increasing at this time, and that's why the issue of poverty becomes even more pressing. Economically, I think the short answer is yes, because let's take, for example, I've actually done some work on sort of the medical history of Geneva, and one of the things it shows is that I think there were like 15 physicians, doctors in Geneva at this time. I think 13 of them are French. And I asked Ray Menser, who works on French history, about this, and he said, well, Geneva doesn't have a medical school, so they're going to come from somewhere. And the closest medical school is in France. So you get this, and the number of physicians actually increasing at this time too. So you're getting people Geneva needs to it needs resources from outside of Geneva to do things. The printing press is another big one. A lot of people come. Laurent de Normandy, he's a book trade financier in Geneva. These are, and there's printers who come as well, open publishing houses and presses. These are things that Geneva would have had a little bit of, but after Calvin, those really grow. So they become, I guess, ways to boost the economy, so to speak. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Before we do that, I want to make sure everybody knows that there's a reception in the Great Room just after our event here. So we hope that after this last question, we can all head together over to the Great Room. Jim, I saw your hand moving.
I haven't really thought about religious refugees in the Reformation. What other kinds of had to have gone both ways?
Right. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Can you say something general about that? I don't think I've ever heard of it.
So Karen Spearling wrote a book about baptism of children. And one of the things you see in Geneva, and she works on Geneva, and one of the things she notices in her work is that you get these parents who live in Geneva and they're willing to accept Reform religion, right? But then they send their children to Catholic areas, to Catholic relatives in Catholic regions, to grow up there, to be raised by them, and eventually to marry into those families. And so this actually comes before the consistory. The consistory says, excuse me, parents, come over here. Can you explain to me why you sent your daughter or son to the Catholic region? Because then they will not be educated in Reform religion. And they usually say something like, well, the relative is a rich relative. They can afford to take another child of mine and raise them. Why should I say no to that? Right? That's like the most common type of interaction. And so this becomes a little bit of a conundrum for the Reformed community in Geneva. So what do they say about that? So one of the things that happens is the boundaries are not as stark as one might initially imagine. There is some fluidity in these boundaries. A lot of times the consistory will let it go, especially if there's some economic reason why the children have to be raised somewhere else by another relative. So in that sense, the parent gets off the hook, right? But there is still the questioning of it. There's still this sense of, so what about that? Aren't you concerned about your child's education and religious formation, right? So it comes up. So yeah, and then there are people who obviously do leave, right? They'll leave Geneva, and from the outside they'll, say things, write things, comment on things, because they don't have to move that far. They can stay within the Swiss regions and find another Catholic region, and it wouldn't have been a huge move for them. But yes, it was going both ways in that sense. And in some sense, they were trying to. There are some cities where they just coexist as well. Thank you.
Okay.